my books in the Eden series really approach that question from quite a nuts and bolts sort of perspective, from a terrestrial perspective. So what I do is I plumb the wisdom of our ancestors, our indigenous stories, our ancestral narratives and ancient texts. And I find that they are full of wisdom regarding the story of humanity, stories of human origins, an explanation of our place in the cosmos. And certainly when I read the ancient texts, including the Bible, it points to humanity being part of a far longer story than ever you or I learned at school. Now, I think the received wisdom right now is that planet Earth is 3.8 billion years old. Well, when Francis Crick discovered the double helix of DNA back in the 1960s, for which he was awarded the Nobel Prize, by his calculations, looking at genetic coding, looking at the structure of DNA, he came to the conclusion that 3.8 billion years isn't long enough for DNA to have found its order and generated the coherent forms of life which it has on planet Earth. And so, to his mind, that pushed the origins of life off planet Earth prior to 3.8 billion years and further out into the galaxy, farther out into the cosmos. And so he was a very confident proponent of the theory of panspermia. And panspermia is the idea that the genetic coding for biological life, biological conscious life, us included, is as much an essential property of the cosmos as are the properties of light and the properties of gravity. That in fact, the genetic coding for life is the norm in the cosmos rather than the exception. And that whenever it lands in an hospitable environment, essentially that means a planet the right kind of size with water, it will generate forms of life similar to the ones we're familiar with on planet Earth. And that is a nuts and bolts version of what Plato taught 2,500 years ago. So really, I think to answer in the most fundamental way, I'd love to go to Plato's version of panspermia and just unpack that for a few moments. Because while I find it very interesting to talk about our evolution as a species, interventions in our development as a species, which is very much a 3D on planet Earth kind of story, Plato takes it to another level. And so on the basis of applying logic to things we all observe, and on the basis of listening to ancestral narratives, and on the basis of his own experience through altered states of consciousness, he argues that before there was the material cosmos, there was the cause of the material cosmos. And the cause, by his understanding, was consciousness, a unified field of consciousness, which expresses itself as the material cosmos. When I say that, I always picture a little bird waking up. And little birds, when they wake up, they will stretch this wing, then they'll stretch that wing, and then stretch that leg, and they'll start singing. And once they've done all that, they're feeling their bodies, they're awake. And Plato speaks about this unified field of consciousness, in effect, doing that. And that when the field does that, it emanates as the material cosmos. And it is as if everything in the cosmos is a fractalization of that primordial field of consciousness. And that means that the stars exist because of consciousness. Gravity exists because of consciousness. The planet exists. The conditions for life exist. The genetic coding, we exist because we are all fractalizations of this original field. It's a vision that says we are all profoundly connected. And people all around the world of all kinds of spiritual traditions and none resonate with that. People from time to time will have a visceral experience of connection with everything in the cosmos, a momentary glimpse of knowing everything in the cosmos. And Plato would say that's only to be expected, because that's who we are. We are made of the stuff of the cosmos. We are made of light. We are made of gravity. We are made of consciousness. We're made of intelligence. We're emanations of that original unified field. And so by the time we get into the human story, we're already talking about a galaxy, a solar system, a planet that is here for cosmic consciousness to experience itself. And you and I are all aspects of that. So the individual journeys that we're on, the learning journeys, the lives that are a sequence of experiences and reflections on those experiences, those are all little elements of the cosmos experiencing itself, primordial consciousness experiencing itself. And so by Plato's calculation, your and my story is far longer than we at first thought. So I won't give away anybody's ages, myself included, but you and I are aeons older than the age defined by our date of birth on planet Earth. And as we learn and experience models of ascension, Plato says what we're actually doing is recovering things we had before when we were aspects of source consciousness. Everything we learn, everything we experience is a retrieval of information we had before when we were part of everything. And my route into this field of study has been from a background in Christian ministry. So as Omar mentioned, I was an archdeacon for the Anglican Church in Australia, which is one down from a bishop. I was a theological educator, a trainer of pastors, and a church doctor. And that work has required me to study the ancient texts, has required me to consider ancient narratives. And one of the texts that I studied in my years in ministry, one of my favorite texts, is the Gospel of John. And the prologue to that gospel gives a little hint of this Platonic view of things. And I should say the writers of the New Testament knew Plato like the back of their hands. There are about a dozen of the Apostle Paul's top, best known sayings. They're all Plato quotes with a little spin to bring a new layer of meaning to it. And the gospel writers were the same. And so the writer of the Gospel of John knows this story of our origins in the unified field of consciousness, of this temporary incarnate experience, and then our return to the cosmic whole to continue a journey from there. And he puts it into the prologue when he talks about the life of Jesus. He says, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was with God in the beginning. And then the Word became flesh and dwelt among us, one full of grace and truth. And then you read the gospel and you see Jesus helping us to wrestle with the great question of the cosmos. Can we do intelligence, consciousness, harmony as a cosmos of separate, free-willed entities? Is that possible? And Jesus's teaching is, yes, it's possible. Everything that answers yes to that question we can call good. Everything that answers no to that question we might call bad, but it's all part of the cosmic learning. Jesus reflects that in his teaching. And then at the end of the gospel, in his prayer to his Father, the source of the cosmos, Jesus says, and now I'm returning back to you, back to the unity we enjoyed before the foundation of the world. And so that story arc from union with source to an individuated, separate experience and back to union with the source, what the Gnostics called the great repose. That is actually the model of all of our lives. And it tells us that all our lives are a far longer affair than this earthly cycle of experience. So for me, that's a very grand way of beginning the question of what is our true history? What is our true identity? We are beings of consciousness who pre-existed this life and will post-exist it. Right now, we're to have an interesting and educative and hopefully enjoyable experience as possible within this material realm, and learn as much as we can so that we enrich the whole upon our return. So for me, that's the big picture. British mathematician Alfred Whitehead once described the whole of the Western tradition of philosophy as no more than a series of footnotes to Plato. And nobody contradicted him. That's quite right. And we should recognize, as you just said, Rob, that Plato was a great synthesizer of world thought. He was a genius for how he expressed it and argued logically for the ideas that he put forward. But he's very open that he got some of these ideas from other places, that he got it from ancient Egypt, and that the ancient Egyptians who passed that information to his friend of a friend, Solon, had got it from the survivors of a previous civilization. And it was from there that he got terrestrial information about something you mentioned earlier today, the periodic resets of planet Earth, the periodic resets of civilization on Earth. So Plato acknowledges that he has these sources. He also hints that he may have other people providing him information who he refers to as people, but they live much longer than normal human beings. They have a fuller understanding of deep space, and they live on islands in the air or islands in the sky. So frankly, I think we have a name for that kind of people. We're talking about extraterrestrial visitors. And some of the information that Plato had really could only have come from such people. When, for instance, Plato describes what planet Earth looks like, he says it is a sphere suspended in space, and from a distance, it's swirled with color like a marble. And he says it's white and it's blue and it's gold. And suddenly he's describing Earth as it really does look from a distance. How could he possibly know? Unless someone who'd seen it from a distance had told him. He may have traveled, but he doesn't say that. He may have remote viewed, but he doesn't say that. What he does mention is these people on islands in the sky who have a deeper understanding of space and know about the movement of objects through space. So if I add 2 and 2 together and get 4.1, I would say that's another source of Plato's information. And I'm pleased to hear that, because I've often wondered, and I wondered for decades really, as I studied the Bible, how it could possibly be that within the first 11 chapters of the Bible are references to what may be as many as 5 separate planetary resets. How would we know? Because were there survivors from every planetary reset? How many tens or hundreds of thousands of years back are we going if we've got 5 of them? And then, as a pedantic young evangelical Bible scholar, I was always very focused on what the words mean in the texts. I mean, it's an obvious thing to say. If you want to understand a text, you need to know what the words mean. But when you go to the root meanings of these words, which I started to do in my early 20s, thanks to my mum and dad, I was able to invest in some interlinear Bibles and some wonderful lexicons, and I could see the root meanings in front of me. And then I could see what the translators had done with them. And when I got to Genesis 9, 10, and 11, I found what appeared to me to be a reference to a time when there was only one landmass on the planet and only one coastline. Well, I thought, hold on a minute, that's Pangaea. I know about that, but the texts here seem to be suggesting Pangaea was populated with people. Now, if it was, we could know nothing about that, because by this point, it would be ground to a powder. Whatever materials they lived and worked with, it would be ground to a powder by now. So how could the writers of those texts possibly know about previous civilizations going that far back? I mean, that's not Homo sapiens. That's a different civilization occupying our planet. Well, I think Plato gives a hint as to how we might know, and it is the cultures of people who are much longer lived than Homo sapiens, who live on islands in the sky and who come and go from deep space. And so now I've got more of a framework and more of a confidence to say, yes, I think the timeline of Earth is older. I think the timeline of humanity is older, and the timeline of civilization on Earth is older even than Homo sapiens. The Efik people in Nigeria have the same story of Abassi and Atai living on an island in the sky. And it is a place of no wanting. It's the place where the first humans are fed and medicated and looked after. And what I love about these stories is these cultures all have their own language and metaphor by which to tell the story. So it's not a text that's gone around the world and been translated. It's not an oral tradition that's gone around the world in Chinese whispers. It is a visual memory that has then been curated in separate and independent narrative traditions, each culture finding its own names, language, metaphors to describe what their ancestors saw. Now we're in a very privileged position of being able to compare notes among all these cultures. We can read these different traditions and we can see the correlations. And that's part of what Plato did. And it's part of what is very easy for us to do in the present day. You know, with the internet, it is easy to get free access to literature that gives witness to all these different traditions and storylines. And when you see the overlaps, when you see the correlations, you will realize, oh my goodness, something here is being remembered. This is not just fiction or fable. This is something with information in it. A great question, Rob, because some stories, yes, you might say we can see this story must come from a time when a lot of us lived in the same place, and then we migrated and we carried our memories with us. And Dragon's story, which we looked at in, I think it was the last Portal to Ascension Summit, is an example of that. So Julien Duy at the Sorbonne in Paris has analyzed the world's canon of dragon stories and then correlated the thematic patterns with what we know about human migrations. And in that way, he's been able to date the stories and say, well, that story, say the Rainbow Serpent story of Australia, the story of the four dragons and the Jade Emperor in China, they must be very early because they're from a time when Aboriginal Australians and the ancestors of the Chinese lived in the same place. And so it pushes that story back to 100 to 170,000 years ago. So you can do that with some stories, like the dragon stories, where there's phenomenal overlap all around the world. But there are other stories where I think the metaphor and language is so different, we have to allow that these are different cultures who have found their own way of saying what their ancestors saw. And in the present, we can say their ancestors saw the same thing. I know of two cultures that speak about the arrival of the moon, and one is ancient Greek culture, and in the work of the Greco-Roman poets, But they do reference the Arcadian civilization and then the Proselines, the people who were here before the moon.
Mm-hmm.
And that is really intriguing because the way it's written about, it sounds like human society. So, that puts us in the frame of 200,000 years before present until the present. And so it suggests that it's in that time frame that the moon arrived. Now, the moon being captured by the Earth's gravity, whatever the moon is, would cause cataclysmic conditions on the planet's surface. And indeed, that is what is associated with the moon's arrival. It's a fascinating object, the moon. There are so many anomalies about it. For our planet to have a moon of that size is very odd. To have a moon whose rotation and orbit means the same face always faces us is very odd. That it is the same size for periodic total eclipses is a strange coincidence. So there's a lot that's fascinating about the moon, but it's actually scientific consensus that the moon wasn't always with us, that it was captured either by accident or by design by the Earth's gravity at some point. What is unusual is to suggest it might have happened within human memory. The other culture that talks about the arrival of the moon is the Zulu culture. And it's Wanu and Mpanku, the story of the cosmic egg being rolled across the sky, having been birthed in another star system and then arriving here. That's a very strange story for the ancient Zulu people to invent. They have a very interesting fascination with space, according to a number of their stories. There's the capture of the moon. There's the anomalous low density of the moon, all referenced in that story. And then there's the story of Unkulunkulu that says that life on Earth didn't originate on Earth. So here we have, possibly thousands of years ahead of Francis Crick, the Zulu people coming to the same conclusion, that all the forms of life they were familiar with. And I mean, their survival and their thriving depended on their understanding of life on Earth, the niches of plants and animals. They had experienced them only in the context of planet Earth, and yet their story of origin said none of them originated here. And their story is fascinating because you could take it as a cinematic version of panspermia, or you could take it as a slightly different story, because their story is that fully fledged life forms arrived here. Now, it's not a night and day difference, because if you talk to contemporary evolutionary scientists, they will quietly behind their sleeves talk about patterns of coding that belong to each other, that are ready to generate a coherent new life form. And that's their explanation for the leaps in the fossil record, where instead of a gradual evolution from one form to the next, you have a functional dog, and then you have a functional horse, and then a functional bear, a functional cow, a functional whale. And I remember asking a scientist, a paleobiologist from the Natural History Museum in the UK, how does that work? How do you get from something like a cow to something like a whale in gradual stages where each change has to give a survival advantage? How do you get suddenly a cow with its nostrils moving from here to here? How do you get an eye that can exist in the open air and then exist underwater? And he said, oh, no, it's much more complicated than that. He said, because a lot of those changes have to happen all in one go. The nostril has to move at the same time that the respiratory system changes. The eye has to change at the same time as the skin changes. It has to go aquatic at the same time that a fully functional fish-shaped tail appears. And when I asked, how does that happen? He said, well, the codes belong to each other. Essentially, there's a set of codes for a whale. There's a set of codes for a human being, so on and so forth. So this really is a very intriguing way of restating the question of where everything came from. We exist in code form. Well, the Zulus take it a step further, and they talk about gestation pods arriving on planet Earth, and that when the things in those pods were fully mature and ready, the pods were released by Unkulunkulu, the first man. Out of one pod comes fully fledged lions, out of another fully fledged trees, fish, birds, and they're released to populate planet Earth. Again, I would just ask, how and why would the Zulu people come up with the idea that life on Earth didn't originate here, but originated in deep space? And then Earth was seeded with all these ready-made codes for functional life forms that could thrive on planet Earth. So I find that absolutely fascinating. So there's two examples of stories from deep space, and I think we have more reason to wonder in the 21st century than ever before, and to return to ancestral narratives with more respect than we've allowed them before. Because I think in the past, you know, when the Christian Portuguese and the Christian Spanish turned up in Central and South America and heard a different story of origins to the one they had in their Bibles, perhaps if we allow for the ignorance of the day, they had no particular reason to respect the stories of the locals and had no conscience about obliterating their culture and replacing it with Catholic orthodoxy. Well, now they would have more reason, because there are so many details in those stories, the Mayan stories, that correlate with today's science, that anyone reading it carefully would have to stop and think, wait a minute, I think there might be some vital information in this. The mercy is that these indigenous stories, however fiercely oppressed they may have been, however fiercely attacked, persecuted, texts burned, priesthood slaughtered, these narrative traditions always find a way of surviving and re-emerging in later ages. And we go through periods of history where it's the job of secret societies to keep secrets, to keep a hold of the ancient texts, not to share the ancient knowledge. And then there are other periods that are times of sharing, times of renaissance, times of revival, where the ancient knowledge can come to the surface again so that humanity can be equipped for another leap forward. The Renaissance will be an example of that. And I feel that potentially we are in the same kind of space today. There are lots of pressures on us. There are certainly demographics who would like to keep us as dumbed down as possible, but there's other stuff going on as well, where we suddenly have access to ancestral wisdom that creates the potential for another leap forward in the human experience. And it's really that motivates me in the writing of my books.